In the winter of 1895, 5 men entered a stone cathedral in Boston's South End. Each arrived alone. Each stepped into the same wooden confessional booth number 3, and none of them ever walked out. They were all found slumped inside the dark, narrow box, lifeless. No signs of struggle, no wounds, only the same expression of quiet terror carved into their faces. The cause of death was ruled sudden cardiac arrest, but all 5 men were in perfect health, and all 5 confessed to the same priest. A priest who would later vanish without a trace, leaving behind a torn Bible, a trail of whispers, and one final message scrawled inside a hymnal. I never forgave them. What were they confessing to? What did the priest hear inside that booth? And why does the cathedral still keep that confessional locked to this very day? Tonight, we reopen that door. This is the story of the confessional booth murders and what was buried in the walls of St. Apollonia's Cathedral in the final breath of the 19th century. If you're drawn to true stories that feel like they shouldn't be real, if you believe history sometimes hides more than it reveals, then settle in, subscribe now, and stay with me until the very end, because the most disturbing detail of all was found not in the church, but in the basement of a Boston tenement 17 years later. Let's begin. It began, as these things often do, with a body no one expected to find. The morning of January 3rd, 1895, was gray and bitter, the kind of cold that seeps into the joints and makes wood moan along the grain. The cleaning woman, Margaret Bell, arrived at St. Apollonia's Cathedral just after sunrise, her hands raw from the wind, clutching a rusted ring of keys in one hand and a worn rosary in the other. She had unlocked that same heavy oak door nearly every morning for 20 years. But on that particular morning, she paused. The sanctuary was unusually still, not the kind of stillness that comes from reverence or quiet prayer. This was something heavier, thick, the kind of silence that feels like it's holding its breath. She lit a few of the front candles, wiped the ash from the pulpit rail, and made her way toward the back of the cathedral, where the confessional booths lined the southern wall, 3 of them. Identical, narrow, tall, carved from dark cherry wood, with slatted partitions and red velvet curtains, always pulled shut. Except that morning, one curtain wasn't drawn. Booth number 3 hung partially open. Margaret approached cautiously. She was not the kind to jump at shadows, but she later said the air near the confessional felt colder than the rest of the church, as if something old and damp had crept in from beneath the stone floor. She cleared her throat, gently tugged the curtain aside, and that's when she saw him. A man, mid-30s, dressed in black wool, hat still in his lap. His face pale, his mouth slightly parted, and his eyes fixed on nothing at all. He looked as though he had simply stopped living. No blood, no bruises, no sign of violence. His head rested against the wooden partition, almost as if he were listening for something in the silence on the other side. The priest on duty that morning, Father Augustine Mallory, was summoned immediately. The police were called. A doctor pronounced the man dead by what he termed sudden cardiac failure. A name was eventually produced: Thomas Alders, a local bookkeeper and veteran of the Spanish-American War. No history of heart issues. No wife, no children. Just a sister in Roxbury who said he'd been troubled in recent weeks, though she didn't know why. Something had been weighing on him, she claimed. He'd been praying more than usual. He'd spoken to someone at the church that morning. That much was clear, and he had spoken from that booth. But Father Mallory, who had been taking confessions that day, claimed to remember nothing. He told police he'd stepped away for a moment to retrieve communion wafers from the back chapel and returned to find the man already inside the booth. Mallory swore he had not heard the man's confession, swore the man must have died before he even began speaking. The detective assigned to the case, a practical man named Desmond Healy, later remarked, "I've seen men die in bar fights, on ice wagons, in brothels and gutters, but never sitting politely in church clothes, like he just drifted out of himself mid-prayer." They chalked it up to stress, to hidden illness, to the weary soul of a man who had perhaps simply lost the will to carry on. The booth was closed, cleaned, and by the following Sunday, confessions resumed as usual. No one questioned the priest further. Not yet. Fade to archival-style photograph of the cathedral exterior. Caption: St. Apollonia's Cathedral, South End, Boston. 1890. Taken 3 years before the murders. But something had shifted. Parishioners began noticing odd things, just small details. One woman reported that the votive candles near the third confessional wouldn't stay lit. A boy claimed he heard whispering in the booth when no one was inside. The altar boys refused to walk past it alone. Father Mallory dismissed it all. He was a thin, cold-eyed man in his late 50s, known more for his discipline than his warmth. He did not believe in ghosts or superstition. He believed in repentance, sacrifice, and silence. When questioned again by parish elders about the man's death, he reportedly said, "If Mr. Alders died in the presence of God, then he was luckier than most." 3 weeks passed, and then it happened again. January 28th. Another man, Joseph Brenner, aged 41, a shipping clerk from Chelsea, attended early morning mass, approached booth number 3. A choir member remembered seeing him enter the cathedral with a handkerchief clenched in one hand, as if preparing himself. He stepped into the booth, was inside for nearly 20 minutes. When the next person in line opened the curtain, the man was dead. Again, slumped forward, no sign of trauma, mouth slightly parted. Just like the first. This time, Father Mallory admitted he had heard something. He claimed Brenner had only spoken 2 words. Words Mallory would repeat to the police, and to the bishop's investigators, and again to the press when they caught wind of the story 2 days later. 2 words, "He waits." That was all. The papers ran wild with it. Death in the confessional, 2 men struck by the same fate. Priest hears message from the beyond. Booth of shadows. They printed photographs of the confessional, interviewed local clergy, whispered of poison, curses, madness. Some even accused Father Mallory of involvement, of administering some sort of chemical through the wood slats, a slow-working powder to silence secrets he didn't want heard. But no powder was found. No poison. No evidence of foul play. Only that same peaceful, unnatural posture. That same half-open mouth, as though silenced mid-sentence. Father Mallory was suspended briefly, sent to the rectory for spiritual retreat, but after 2 weeks and no further deaths, he returned. The archbishop, desperate to quell hysteria, issued a formal statement. There is no threat within the house of God. These were natural deaths in unnatural times. Still, booth number 3 was sealed for 6 days, then reopened without announcement. The church carried on, but something had begun to rot in the walls. It would take 3 more deaths before they finally locked that booth for good. 3 more men, each with a secret, each with something to confess. And Father Mallory, who would eventually disappear without a trace, never altered his story. He claimed to have never heard anything, except once, and what he heard was, "He waits." The first 2 deaths were unsettling, but something about the third would shatter the fragile calm that still clung to St. Apollonia's Cathedral. By February 12, 1895, the congregation had grown thin. The pews, once packed with faithful Catholics from Boston's South End, now creaked under the weight of only a handful of regulars. Rumors whispered through the cobblestone streets, rumors of curses, evil spirits, and a priest with secrets. But still, booth number 3 remained unlocked. The heavy red velvet curtain still pulled aside, beckoning. That morning, a man named Samuel O'Donnell arrived early. A quiet figure in his 60s, Samuel was a retired dock worker, grizzled, stoic, a fixture of the neighborhood. His thick hands bore the marks of decades hauling cargo, his lined face softened only by eyes that watched more than they spoke. He rarely attended church, not for lack of faith, but because the cathedral reminded him too much of his past, the losses, the drowned brothers, the fires on the wharves. But on this cold winter morning, something drove him inside. He took a seat near the back, eyes fixed on the ornate wooden confessional booths along the wall. He watched as parishioners came and went, their faces pale, their footsteps hesitant. The air felt different, heavy, watching the booth with a kind of dread. At 7:15 a.m., Samuel saw a man approach, younger than most who frequented the church, clean-shaven, wearing a worn wool coat. His name was Patrick Moran, a local clerk who had recently lost his wife to fever. Moran moved slowly, his hands shaking as he clutched a folded piece of paper. Samuel felt a strange pull, a silent urging to pay attention. Moran approached booth number 3. He paused, looked around, as if expecting someone. Then, without a word, he stepped inside. For nearly 30 minutes, the church remained quiet. Samuel shifted uneasily in his pew, eyes fixed on the booth's shadowed interior. Then came a sudden sound, a muffled cry, almost inaudible. Samuel's heart quickened. The cry stopped abruptly. Moments later, a faint rustle of fabric, then silence. Samuel wanted to rise, to call for help, but he remained frozen. When the next visitor reached the booth and pulled aside the curtain, the horror was revealed. Patrick Moran sat slumped in the same posture as the others, pale, eyes glassy, mouth slightly open, as if he had whispered his final words and then simply breathed no more. Samuel's breath caught. But then, something else. A faint movement. A whisper. The church fell silent as Samuel watched Moran's hand twitch once, twice, before going still. Pause. Sound of a long, slow exhale. A faint heartbeat sound begins, then fades. Father Mallory was summoned again. The police returned. The doctor pronounced Moran dead. Once again, sudden cardiac arrest, no apparent cause. But the police were growing skeptical. Detective Desmond Healy returned to the cathedral, this time with his partner, a younger officer named James Cullen. They examined the confessional booth carefully. Inside, on the wooden bench where Moran had sat, they found a single folded scrap of paper. Sound of paper unfolding. The narrator reads in a hushed, deliberate tone. Forgive me, but he waits, and I cannot run. Samuel O'Donnell remained in the church, silent but watchful. He was the only one who saw what no one else did. Shift in tone, a whisper, barely audible. Something inside the booth. A shadow, darker than the darkness of the room itself, moving just beyond the slatted partition. A presence. Samuel never spoke of it. He never told the police. He never even told his daughter. He only left the church that morning with a silent prayer on his lips, a prayer that no one else would enter booth number 3 again. Sound. Footsteps fading into snow crunching outside. But they did. 3 more men would die in that cursed booth before the church finally sealed it forever. And the story would grow darker still. The church had become a place both of sanctuary and dread. Despite the mounting deaths, many still attended St. Apollonia's Cathedral each Sunday, their voices trembling as they prayed, trying to hold on to their faith. Yet no one dared approach booth number 3. Father Mallory remained resolute, silent on many questions, distant from his flock, but insisting all was well. But inside that confessional, the darkness was growing thicker and the silence deeper. The 4th death would come on a day that seemed no different from any other. February 26, 1895. A cold, damp Wednesday morning. That day, the man who entered the booth was Reverend Henry Crowley. A visiting cleric from a neighboring parish, Reverend Crowley was a man of stern conviction and scholarly bearing. His crisp, black cassock and polished shoes gave him an air of formality unusual for the South End. He had arrived in Boston the day before to conduct a series of lectures on ecclesiastical history and morality. But that morning, drawn by the troubling rumors and the whispered fears surrounding St. Apollonia's, he had come to pray. He sat in the 3rd booth for nearly an hour. When the curtain finally pulled back, he was found slumped over, eyes closed, pale and unmoving. No wounds. No cause. Just the same quiet end. Sound of murmuring parishioners, hurried footsteps, the rattling of chains as the church doors lock. The church authorities were now forced to act. Bishop Thomas Gilroy arrived that very afternoon, a stout man with a ruddy face and sharp eyes. His calm veneer belied the weight of the crisis now on his shoulders. He ordered the confessional sealed. A heavy oak board was nailed across booth number 3. No one was to enter again. But the damage had been done. Parishioners whispered of curses, of evil that hid behind the sacred walls. The press, smelling scandal and mystery, descended upon the church. Articles ran with headlines like "The Booth of Death," "Confessions of the Damned," and "Silent Murders in God's House." Sound of a newspaper rustling, ink-smudged headlines read aloud. 5 men dead in the space of 2 months. No cause. No explanation. A priest's silence raises questions. Has evil taken root within our sanctuaries? And yet Father Mallory said nothing. He maintained the line he had told the police. He heard no confessions, no cries, no warnings. Except those 2 chilling words, he waits. In the days that followed, the cathedral felt empty. The pews remained half-filled, but the atmosphere was strained, brittle. Few dared to speak of booth number 3. Even fewer dared to look at it. But one man could not forget. Samuel O'Donnell. Sound of slow, deliberate footsteps echoing in a near-empty church. Samuel's mind churned with questions. What had he really seen in that booth? What was the presence lurking behind the velvet curtain? He had tried to dismiss the memory, but the shadow haunted him. It was not merely darkness. It was something alive, something waiting. One evening, late in February, Samuel returned to the church after hours. The cathedral was silent, but for the flicker of a single candle left burning on the altar. He approached booth number 3. The wooden board nailed across the front seemed to pulse in the dim light. He placed his hand against it. And then he heard it. A faint, rasping breath. Pause. Sound of a slow, deep breath, then silence. Samuel stumbled back, heart pounding. He knew then, something was trapped inside. Something ancient. Something patient. Something evil. That night, Samuel could not sleep. He thought of the 5 men who had died. Their secrets. Their confessions. What had they told the darkness? Asterisk. Sound of wind outside. A faint, ghostly whisper. He waits. He waits. Asterisk. The silence behind the curtain was not empty. It was full of voices. The following morning, Samuel sought out Father Mallory. He found the priest in the rectory, sitting alone in a dim room filled with religious icons and dusty books. Samuel told him everything. About the breath, the shadow, the voices. Father Mallory's face hardened. He said only this. Some sins are not meant to be spoken aloud. Some truths are too terrible to confess. Sound of a heavy book closing. In the days that followed, the city buzzed with talk of the confessional curse. Local clergy convened emergency meetings. The bishop commissioned an investigation. The church doors stayed open, but the confessional booths stayed sealed. But rumors spread. About a secret hidden deep in the cathedral's foundation. About a man, or a presence, who had waited centuries. About the original builder of St. Apollonia's, who had vanished without a trace. Sound of old parchment being unrolled. Samuel dug deeper. He visited the city archives. He searched for any record of the cathedral's construction, its architects, its history. There, buried beneath layers of dust and forgotten paper, he found a name. Ignatius Blackwood. A master carpenter and woodworker. A man obsessed with sacred geometry, with hidden symbols carved into wood. A man who had disappeared suddenly in 1878, the year construction was completed. Rumors said he was cursed, that his work contained a secret so dark it could destroy souls. Samuel's heart raced. Could the confessional booth itself be a prison? A trap? Sound of a candle being extinguished. That night, he returned once more to the cathedral. He studied the booth, ran his fingers over the intricate carvings. He noticed something new, a barely visible symbol etched deep in the wood grain. A circle enclosing a twisted cross. A sigil of ancient warning. The air grew colder. The shadows lengthened. Samuel knew then that the darkness was no accident. It was waiting for the next confession. The city of Boston shivered under a bleak February sky. St. Apollonia's cathedral sat like a stone sentinel over the south end, its Gothic spires clawing into the clouds, its walls hiding secrets older than the city itself. Inside, the tension was palpable. After the deaths, the sealed confessional booth stood as a grim reminder of an evil no one could explain. The investigation was intensifying. Bishop Gilroy had authorized an official inquiry. Detective Desmond Healy returned to the cathedral, this time with his full team, determined to uncover what had killed 5 men in one of God's most sacred places. But what they found was a riddle wrapped in darkness. The confessional booth was meticulously examined. Woodworkers, carpenters, even occult experts were called in. But no explanation emerged. No physical cause. No mechanism of death. Sound of tools tapping wood. Murmured conversations. Faint echo of footsteps. The strange symbol Samuel O'Donnell had found was documented. A circle enclosing a twisted cross. A sigil known in occult circles as a mark of binding and curse. Experts whispered about ancient rites, about confessions so terrible they could summon shadows. But the biggest shock came when Detective Healy discovered something hidden beneath the cathedral's floorboards. A small, iron trapdoor, concealed beneath decades of dust and neglect. Sound of creaking wood, scraping of metal. He and his team pried it open. A narrow staircase descended into darkness. Armed with lanterns, they ventured down. The air grew cold and damp. Walls lined with carved stone. At the bottom, a small chamber, walls etched with symbols like those on the confessional booth. An altar stood in the center, stained dark with something that glistened under the lantern light. Sound of dripping water, faint chanting echoing in the distance. It was clear, this was a secret chamber. A place of ritual. But what kind? Who had built it? Historical records offered a clue. Ignatius Blackwood, the cathedral's master carpenter. He was not just a craftsman. He was a member of a secret society, a group obsessed with unlocking the boundaries between the sacred and the profane. They believed that sin could be trapped, bound, and even used as a weapon. Sound of a thick book being opened. The writing spoke of the confessional curse, a ritual that bound souls to a place, a trap for the damned. Those who confessed the darkest sins in the wrong way would be taken, their life force drained, their bodies left lifeless. A punishment for the most grievous transgressions. Detective Healy felt a chill. Could this be what had happened in booth number 3? Had these men confessed sins so terrible that the curse had claimed them? But the question remained, who was the priest? The man who heard nothing but left behind a torn Bible and the words, "I never forgave them." Father Mallory became a person of intense scrutiny. Some parishioners whispered he was hiding something. He had refused to leave the city during the investigation. His eyes were haunted, his words cryptic. Samuel O'Donnell confronted Father Mallory one evening after Mass. He demanded answers. The priest's reply was chilling. "There are sins even I cannot absolve," he said softly. "Some doors are better left closed." Sound of a door closing slowly, echo fading. The cathedral's mystery deepened. The confessional booth was sealed, but the darkness had not left. Whispers persisted in the streets. In the night, some claimed to hear murmurs from beneath the church chanting, sobbing, desperate prayers. And the victims' families began to speak. They told of strange dreams, shadows in their homes, cold drafts passing through locked rooms. The curse was not confined to the church. It was spreading. The city waited, breath held tight. For what? For the next confession. For the next death. For the truth buried beneath the stone and shadow. Sound fades into silence, broken only by a single heartbeat slowing to stillness. The weeks passed, but the cloud hanging over St. Apollonia's cathedral grew heavier, thicker, like a suffocating fog that refused to lift. The city's once bustling south end had fallen into a hush of fear. People avoided the cathedral at night, and even the daylight brought only a chilling quiet. No one knew what to make of the deaths, so sudden, so strange, so unexplained. But one figure lingered in the shadows, watched by wary eyes, Father Nathaniel Mallory. Father Mallory had become a man transformed. Once a quiet servant of God, devoted and kind, he was now withdrawn, pale, and jittery. Parishioners whispered of strange sightings, the priest talking to himself in low, broken tones, standing alone for hours in the cold crypt beneath the cathedral, locking himself in his chambers until dawn. Sound of a door creaking opened slowly, soft footsteps approaching. Detective Desmond Healy had grown suspicious. He returned to the rectory late one evening, determined to uncover the truth behind the priest's behavior. Samuel O'Donnell accompanied him, carrying the heavy weight of his own growing fears. Together, they waited outside Father Mallory's door, listening. Inside, the priest muttered in Latin, a prayer, or perhaps a curse. The words were hurried, desperate, pleading. Then silence. Sound of a key turning, door opening. The door creaked open. Father Mallory's eyes were wild, haunted. He said nothing as the two men stepped inside. The room was sparse, only a small desk cluttered with old parchments, a flickering candle, and a worn Bible, its pages stained and dog-eared. Samuel spotted a folded letter on the desk. He unfolded it carefully. The ink was faded but still legible. It was a confession, not a typical one. This letter told of a dark secret, a burden Father Mallory had carried for years. The letter revealed that Mallory had discovered the true nature of the confessional booth years before the murders began. He knew the curse was real. He had tried to destroy the booth, but it was too powerful, bound by ancient magic and blood. And the priest who had disappeared, the one who heard the confessions and then vanished, was no ordinary man. He was the original keeper of the curse. Father Mallory confessed that he had inherited the role unwillingly, trapped in a cycle of silence and suffering. He was the one who never forgave them. The victims' souls were bound to the booth, trapped between worlds. And Mallory feared that his own time was running out. Sound of thunder rolling softly, rain tapping at the window. Desmond and Samuel pressed the priest for answers. How to end the curse. How to free the trapped souls. But Mallory only shook his head. There is no simple release, he whispered. Only sacrifice. Days later, a new figure entered the story. A woman, Clara Winthrop, a scholar of ancient rites and forgotten lore. She arrived in Boston after hearing whispers of the confessional curse. Clara sought out Samuel, hoping to help unravel the mystery. Together, they pored over old manuscripts, searching for a way to break the dark bond. Sound of flipping pages, candlelight flickering. They discovered references to a ritual, one that could sever the curse, but only at great cost. The ritual required confession of one's own deepest sin, offered willingly, with the intent to free those trapped. It was dangerous, risky, perhaps fatal. The group debated. Father Mallory refused to participate. He believed he was already too entwined with the darkness. But Samuel and Clara were determined. As the days wore on, strange things continued to happen. The cathedral seemed alive with restless energy. Candles flickered without wind. The confessional booth pulsed with an eerie glow. And in the night, a voice whispered from within. He waits. The cold bit through the cracked window panes of the rectory, as if the winter itself was trying to claw its way inside. Outside, Boston was a city cloaked in silence, snow muffling footsteps and swallowing sound. But inside the old stone walls of St. Apollonia's Cathedral, a storm of a different sort was gathering. Father Nathaniel Mallory sat by the flickering fireplace, the pale light casting long, trembling shadows across his hollowed face. The confession letter, with its cryptic warnings and grim truths, had unsettled him deeply. It was not just a piece of parchment, it was a chain wrapped tightly around his soul. Across the room, Clara Winthrop unpacked her worn leather satchel, pulling out fragile, yellowed manuscripts and strange symbols scrawled in ink so faded it threatened to disappear with each touch. She placed them carefully on the desk, the weight of history pressing down with every page. Samuel O'Donnell stood near the window, staring into the snow-dusted streets below. His mind raced with the knowledge of the curse, the deaths, the terrible power lurking inside the confessional booth. Yet, despite the fear, there was a spark of resolve burning inside him. This mystery would be unraveled, or it would consume them all. The room fell into a heavy silence, broken only by the occasional crackle of burning logs and the distant, mournful tolling of the cathedral's bells. The ancient building seemed to breathe with a life of its own, a living witness to the darkness that had festered beneath its foundations for centuries. "We have to begin the ritual," Clara said quietly, breaking the silence. Father Mallory's gaze lifted, haunted and weary. "It is dangerous. More dangerous than you can imagine." Clara nodded, determination hardening her features. "I know. But if we don't try, more will die. The curse will claim more souls." Samuel stepped forward. "Then let's not waste time. Tell us what to do." Clara spread the fragile manuscripts before them, tracing her finger over the ancient script. "The ritual requires a confession," she explained. "Not just any confession. It must be the true, deepest sin of the one offering it. It must be made with complete honesty and intent to free those trapped by the curse." Father Mallory's voice trembled. "I have tried to confess my sins to God. But this is different. It is a confession made to the darkness itself." The room seemed to grow colder, shadows lengthening as if responding to his words. Clara glanced at him, her eyes sharp. "The confessional booth is a prison, yes. But it is also a gate. The ritual will open it, and hopefully, close it forever." Outside, the storm grew fiercer. Wind howled through the narrow alleys, rattling shutters and tossing debris like lost souls across the icy streets. Inside the cathedral, preparations began. The team gathered tools and candles, drawing strange symbols on parchment, readying themselves for a confrontation that felt like stepping into a nightmare. The night of the ritual arrived like a slow breath held tight. St. Apollonia's was emptied of all but the three, Mallory, Clara, and Samuel. The ancient stones seemed to hum with anticipation. The confessional booth awaited, dark, silent, a vessel of unknown horrors. The flickering candlelight cast eerie shapes on its worn wooden panels, and the carved symbol Samuel had discovered glowed faintly, as if alive. Clara knelt by the booth, tracing the ancient marks with a trembling hand. "This symbol is the key," she said softly. "It binds the souls." Mallory nodded, voice barely above a whisper. "It was carved by those who built the cathedral, in secret rites long forgotten." The three prepared for the ritual. Samuel was to make the first confession, a sin from his past he had never spoken aloud. The air grew thick, heavy with unseen eyes watching, waiting. Samuel approached the confessional booth, heart pounding, every breath a struggle. Inside, the darkness was nearly complete. He knelt, hands trembling, and whispered the sin that had haunted him for years. The weight of his words seemed to hang in the air, thick as smoke. Suddenly, a cold wind swept through the cathedral, snuffing out candles. The confessional booth pulsed with a dark light, and the whispering voices began, faint, agonized, desperate. The souls trapped inside stirred. Samuel fell back, gasping for breath. Mallory stepped forward, pale but steady. "It is working," he said. "The curse is stirring." Clara began the next phase, chanting in an ancient tongue, calling on powers both sacred and profane. The cathedral walls seemed to breathe, the very stones humming with power. Suddenly, a piercing scream shattered the silence. From the shadows, a figure appeared, a ghostly vision of the vanished priest Ignatius, his face twisted in torment. The winter night stretched over Boston like a velvet shroud, heavy with the weight of secrets long buried. Within the cold stone walls of St. Apollonia's Cathedral, an unsettling silence had settled, one that spoke not of peace, but of anticipation. The flickering candlelight danced against the ancient wood, casting restless shadows that seemed to whisper and shift beyond the reach of understanding. Father Nathaniel Mallory, Clara Winthrop, and Samuel O'Donnell had faced horrors beyond the realm of ordinary faith, confronting the cursed confessional booth and the malevolent forces it harbored. Yet, as the night deepened, it became clear that the ritual to free the trapped souls had only begun to unravel the tangled web of darkness that had ensnared the cathedral for decades. The echoes of their actions still reverberated through the stone corridors, as unseen eyes watched their every move. Something ancient, something unforgiving, stirred in the shadows, and the price for confronting it would be steep. Nathaniel paced the chamber adjacent to the sanctuary, the worn floorboards creaking beneath his steps. The weight of the confessions pressed heavily on his spirit, each revelation chipping away at the remnants of his hope. The mysterious deaths, the priest who vanished without a trace, the torn Bible left as a cryptic message, all were threads woven into a tapestry of despair and malevolence. Clara sat at the desk, poring over the fragile manuscripts once more. Her fingers traced the faded ink of ritualistic incantations and cryptic symbols, an ancient language of protection and release. She had devoted countless hours to deciphering their meaning, but the more she learned, the more the mystery deepened. Samuel, still shaken from his confrontation with the spectral priest Ignatius, remained near the chapel's threshold, his eyes scanning the darkness beyond the flickering candlelight. The air was thick with foreboding, as if the very cathedral itself breathed with a malignant life. "We have disturbed something ancient," Clara whispered, breaking the silence. "Something that was never meant to be touched." Nathaniel nodded grimly. "The sins confessed within that booth, they are not just personal transgressions. They are wounds in the fabric of this place." Samuel swallowed hard. "What happens now? How do we end this?" Clara's gaze lifted, her eyes gleaming with resolve. "We must uncover the truth behind Ignatius' disappearance. Only by understanding the past can we hope to break the curse." The search led them deep into the cathedral's forgotten crypts, a labyrinth of dust-covered tombs and faded epitaphs. The flicker of their lanterns revealed long-forgotten inscriptions, remnants of those who had built and guarded the sanctuary through centuries of faith and fear. Amidst the crumbling stonework, they discovered a hidden chamber, sealed with an iron-bound door etched with the same arcane symbols found on the confessional booth. The air grew colder, heavier, as if the threshold itself resisted their intrusion. With trembling hands, Clara traced the inscription, murmuring an invocation of opening. The door groaned on rusted hinges, revealing a narrow passage descending into darkness. Inside, the passage opened into a small chamber, dominated by an altar stained with darkened candle wax and the faintest trace of dried blood. Shelves lined with brittle parchments and cryptic artifacts surrounded the room, tools of a ritualistic past that spoke of sacrifice and sorrow. On the altar lay an ancient tome, its leather cover cracked and worn. Clara carefully opened it, revealing pages filled with meticulous handwriting, detailed accounts of rites performed to contain and conceal a terrible power within the cathedral's walls. Among the entries, one stood out, a confession, not of sin, but of a desperate act to imprison a malevolent spirit that had plagued the city. The priest Ignatius, it seemed, had bound himself to the ritual, becoming both jailer and prisoner. As they delved deeper into the tome, a chilling realization took hold. The curse of the confessional booth was not merely a haunting, but a deliberate sealing of a dark force that threatened to consume everything. The confessions were a prison for souls who had been corrupted, their final moments twisted by the spirit's influence. Nathaniel's voice trembled as he read aloud. He wrote of a penance beyond death, a ritual meant to contain the wrath of an entity born of human guilt and despair. But he warned that the seal was fragile and that any breach could unleash devastation. The weight of those words settled over the trio like a suffocating fog. They were not just confronting restless spirits, they were facing an ancient evil anchored in the very foundations of the cathedral. Suddenly, the chamber's atmosphere shifted. A low rumble echoed through the crypt, and the flickering lanterns cast eerie, dancing shadows that seemed to move of their own accord. From the darkness, a cold wind swept past them, carrying whispers of anguish and fury. Samuel gripped his lantern tightly. "We're not alone down here." From the shadows, a figure emerged, pale, gaunt, and draped in tattered priestly robes. His eyes, hollow and mournful, locked onto Nathaniel with a mixture of accusation and sorrow. "It is I," the apparition intoned, voice echoing like a distant lament. "Ignatius, bound to this place by my own hand." The room's temperature plummeted, breath crystallizing in the air as Ignatius stepped closer, his form flickering like a dying candle. Ignatius' tale unfolded, a story of faith shattered by the horrors he witnessed, of a soul fractured by guilt and despair. He had taken on the curse willingly, believing his sacrifice would protect the city from an ancient evil that fed on human sin. But something had gone terribly wrong. The ritual was incomplete, Ignatius confessed. The darkness grew beyond my control. It twisted the souls I sought to save, binding them in eternal torment. Clara's voice was steady but sorrowful. "Then our task is clear. We must finish what you started." Ignatius nodded, fading slowly. "But beware, the darkness does not forgive. It will seek to claim you, as it has claimed the others." Back in the sanctuary, the trio prepared for the final confrontation. The cathedral seemed to hold its breath, the flickering candlelight casting long shadows that writhed like living things. They returned to the confessional booth, its presence more ominous than ever. The carved symbols glowed faintly, pulsing with a sinister rhythm that echoed the beating of a monstrous heart. Clara began the incantation, her voice steady and resolute. Nathaniel and Samuel joined, their confessions blending into a unified plea for redemption and release. As the ritual reached its climax, the confessional booth shuddered violently. The walls seemed to bleed shadows, and anguished wails filled the cathedral. The darkness fought back, desperate to maintain its hold. But the trio pressed on, their voices rising in a crescendo of hope and defiance. Finally, a blinding light erupted from the booth, illuminating the cathedral with a pure, cleansing glow. The oppressive weight lifted, the shadows retreated, and for the first time in decades, the cathedral was silent. But as they looked around, exhausted and battered, a lingering question remained. Had the curse truly been broken, or had they only delayed the inevitable? The days that followed were quiet. St. Apollonius stood untouched, yet transformed. Parishioners returned in modest numbers, stepping over the threshold with reverence but also with a strange detachment, as if the cathedral, long dormant, had exhaled something it had held for far too long. The air was lighter, cleaner even, but it was also emptier. Clara stayed behind, occupying the rectory library, her notes and the ancient tome spread across the long oak table. Her work was far from over. Though the darkness had withdrawn, its root system remained buried deep in the cathedral's bones. She could feel it, not a haunting now, but an echo, like a wound stitched, but still seeping. Nathaniel moved with a slow, haunted dignity. He resumed his priestly duties, but his sermons lacked the thunder they once held. His words were soft, his gaze always slightly distant. And the booth, though exorcised, remained boarded up. He couldn't bring himself to remove it, nor destroy it. To him, it was not just furniture. It was a tomb. Samuel had left the city altogether. He gave no farewell, no forwarding address. Clara had found a single note left under her books the morning after the ritual. It said only, "Some doors can't be closed. I'm going where there are no more doors." It was on a cold, rain-streaked afternoon in March when Clara found something that made her blood freeze. She had been reviewing the last pages of Ignatius's journal, translating backward through the ink-worn Latin with painful precision. And there it was, an addendum she had somehow missed. A single page slipped between bindings. The handwriting was not Ignatius's. It was sharper, angular, less human. It described a second ritual, a failsafe. It referenced a cleansing flame, something that Ignatius had prepared but had been too afraid to execute. It spoke of purging, of burning the root beneath the altar, and of breaking the bond between the cathedral's foundation and him who hears behind the wood. Clara stared at the passage. The implications gnawed at her rational mind. There was still someone bound beneath the church. And worse, It hadn't been sealed. It had been listening. That night, Clara returned to the sanctuary alone. Nathaniel was out walking the streets, trying to visit a sick parishioner. The air was sharp with wind, and a storm was closing in from the sea. Thunder cracked distantly. She brought the tome, her satchel of ritual tools, and a single oil lantern. Beneath the altar was a narrow crawl space, a hollow in the stone that once held relics. Now it was just blackness, thick with the scent of damp earth and something older. She hesitated only once before sliding into the cold chamber. What she saw stopped her breath. There were carvings in the floor, deep gouges, circular patterns that mimicked the markings in the confessional booth. Only these were darker, older, burned into the stone itself. In the center, embedded like a jewel, was a silver medallion, the shape of a weeping face, mouth stitched shut, with words etched below. Nulla absolutio. No absolution. Clara reached forward, and the moment her fingers grazed the medallion, the entire cathedral shook. From above, Nathaniel sprinted back into the nave just in time to hear the scream. He ran down the side hallway, descended the servant stairs, and found Clara collapsed beside the altar. Her hands were blackened with soot, her eyes wide and terrified, mouth moving with silent prayer. What happened? He demanded, kneeling beside her. Her voice came in pieces. He's still here. Nathaniel. He never left. He feeds, not on sin, not on guilt, but on silence. That's why the priest vanished. That's why the confessions were all quiet. No one remembered what they said. Nathaniel stared at her. Clara's voice cracked. It's not the sin he craves. It's the moment after, the void, the silence that comes when guilt is unspoken. They left the cathedral that night. Neither slept. At dawn, they returned, armed not with Latin scripture or incense, but with dynamite. If there was truly a root, a living cord between the building and this thing that had claimed so many lives, they would sever it with fire and fury. The plan was simple. Ignite the crawlspace beneath the altar and collapse the hidden chamber. Bury whatever was listening down there in tons of rubble and blessed ash. They stood together at the altar, each holding a fuse line. Are we sure? Nathaniel asked. No, Clara whispered. But if we walk away, it starts again. They lit the fuses. A thunderclap cracked overhead, and the cathedral erupted from within. From outside, those few who lived near St. Apollonia's saw only fire. A dull roar, a tower of smoke, and a strange shimmer of light in the stained glass windows, as if the saints themselves were weeping. No one was hurt. No bodies were found. But the church was gone. Weeks passed, then months. St. Apollonia's was never rebuilt. The city quietly deeded the land to a small historical society. They fenced it off and called it unstable ground. The earth never settled. Grass would not grow. At night, dogs would not approach the ruins. Birds flew over it in strange arcs. And then, a year to the day after the fire, someone placed a confessional booth on the edge of the ruin. No one saw who left it. There were no witnesses, no footprints. It was old, worn, and closed. On the door, a message carved in Latin, barely visible under peeling varnish. I still listen. The morning after the fire, Boston awoke to silence. Not the usual hush of early light or the sluggish peace of a city catching its breath, but a deeper, unsettled quiet. The kind of silence that made old houses creak louder, that made pigeons forget to coo on rooftops. The kind that made every whisper sound like a confession. By sunrise, St. Apollonia's cathedral was nothing more than a blackened shell. The once grand bell tower had collapsed into itself, leaving a jagged silhouette like a broken tooth. Charred rafters stuck out from the rubble like fractured bones, and beneath it all, the earth still smoked, as though something beneath had not yet finished dying. But what unsettled the city most wasn't the fire itself. Fires were common enough. Accidents happened. Lightning struck. Gas lines ruptured. Churches, especially old ones, had fallen before. No. What disturbed people, what made neighbors avoid the block, what made city officials speak in hushed tones, was that no cause was ever found. There was no lightning, no faulty wires, no flammable chemicals, and though some whispered of arson, no evidence supported it. Even the fire marshal's report ended not with a conclusion, but a question. What was this place built over? The ruins were sealed off by temporary fencing. Unstable foundation, read a city-issued warning. But those who lived nearby knew better. They heard it in the wind at night. They saw it in the way the smoke from the rubble refused to rise. It always curled sideways, as if trying to avoid heaven. And then, one night, someone placed the booth. It appeared at dawn, wooden, worn, unmistakable. A single confessional booth sat neatly on the edge of the wreckage, just outside the fenced perimeter. No one saw who brought it. No cart tracks, no footprints in the dirt, no dragging marks. The booth was perfectly intact, polished, clean, except for the door. Carved into the wood, deep and deliberate, were 3 Latin words. Ego te audio. I hear you. The message was unmistakable. The fire had not buried whatever had been listening. It had simply burned the walls down. Across the city, in a cramped boarding house on the edge of South End, Clara Avery woke to a knock on her door. She had not returned to the cathedral's grounds since the fire. Her nights were filled with long, anxious pacing and dreams she couldn't recall upon waking. The ritual had left her hollowed out, raw. She thought of the tunnel under the altar often, and of what had stared back at her in the darkness. She opened the door slowly. A boy stood there, no more than 10, pale, dirt under his fingernails. He held something in both hands, a folded piece of paper. He didn't speak, just held it out. Clara took it. By the time she looked up, the boy was gone. The paper was old, not just yellowed, but parchment, thin and delicate, like the kind found in religious relics. It smelled faintly of myrrh and smoke. On it, in ink so faded it appeared gray, was a single line. The keeper was never in the booth. Clara read it twice. Then again. She sat down slowly, heart tightening. The phrase struck her like a chord plucked from memory, deep, painful, and familiar. She thought of the priest, Father Henrik, the one who vanished before the murders began. Thought of the whispers that followed, that he had gone mad, that he had confessed to a crime he never named, that he had warned others of something waiting inside the cathedral. What if the priest hadn't been the keeper? What if the booth was only the bait? Across town, Father Nathaniel sat inside a small Jesuit seminary, hands folded, eyes staring blankly out the stained glass. He had been taken in by a former colleague after the fire, Father Joseph Neri, a pale, hawk-eyed man who rarely blinked and never smiled. Nathaniel had not spoken of the fire, nor of the ritual. He had offered the Jesuits only that Saint Apollonia's fell to her secrets. Joseph never pressed. But that morning, Joseph placed a book before Nathaniel during breakfast. It was not a Bible. It was a leather-bound record, a register of retired and deceased priests from the Boston diocese, dating back to the mid-1700s. You should read this, Joseph said. Nathaniel opened to the marked page. It was the record of Father Ignatius Caro, founder of St. Apollonia's. His page was brief. No obituary, no record of burial. Just one line in ink. Declared mortal absentia, July 12, 1843. Last known words. There is no priest left. Only a mouth beneath the floor. Nathaniel closed the book. Something deep inside him curled. He had heard that line before. Not spoken, but breathed, when he knelt inside the booth months ago, before the third man died. A voice that hadn't echoed from the screen, but from the wood itself. He stood up. I need to go back. By twilight, Nathaniel was standing again at the ruins. The police line had faded. The temporary fencing barely held together. Most of the public had moved on, the curiosity of the tragedy now buried under fresher headlines. Only a few neighborhood children lingered at a distance, staring not at the rubble, but at the confessional booth. It hadn't moved. It stood there, undisturbed, facing the charred foundation like a silent witness. The words carved into its door, Ego te audio, seemed darker now, as if they had soaked in the soot from the fire itself. Nathaniel approached slowly. Each footstep over the blackened soil sounded too loud in the evening stillness. He could smell the burn even now. Ash, oil, and something deeper. Earth that hadn't seen air in 100 years. He ran his hand over the booth. Smooth. No cracks. No burn marks. As if it had never been touched by flame. As if it had been waiting. Preserved. He opened the door. The inside was pitch black, yet unsoiled. The cushions were red velvet, untouched. The kneeler intact. The dividing screen perfectly carved. Only one thing had changed. There was no seat for the priest. Only a hole. Directly behind the screen, where the priest would sit, the wood had been removed, or perhaps never built. A circular opening about 2 feet wide dropped into darkness. Not ragged like a break, but smooth, rimmed in brass, like a designed opening. Like a drain. Nathaniel stepped back. In his mind, something clicked into place. The booth had never been a place for confession. It had always been a funnel. That night, Clara met Nathaniel in the alley behind her boarding house. He brought no notes, no relics, no cassock, just a letter. "I'm leaving," he said. "Tomorrow." Clara looked at him. "Where?" "Chicago," he lied. She saw it in his face. "You're going back down." He didn't respond. She looked down at the letter in his hand. It wasn't addressed. He handed it to her. "If I'm not back by Sunday, bring this to Father Neri. Don't read it. Just bring it." She took it. "Why go alone?" she asked. "Because this thing, whatever it is, it's old. Older than the cathedral. Older than the priesthood. We let it listen. Now we have to let it speak." That night, Nathaniel returned to the ruins. No one stopped him. No patrols, no priests, no city officials. The booth waited. He stepped inside. This time, with no hesitation. He knelt, not in prayer, but in submission. Then slowly, he leaned forward and placed his hands into the hole where the priest's seat once was. Air drifted upward, damp, sour, and rhythmic. Not wind, not breath. Whispering. He could hear it now. Not a voice, but the pieces of one. Like a dream retelling itself, like hundreds of voices being chewed and swallowed at once. He lowered himself in. Feet first. The brass rim was cold, but it held his weight. He climbed down. The tunnel beneath the booth was narrower than the one beneath the altar had been. Dirt gave way to stone, which gave way to something else. Glass? Bone? He couldn't tell. His oil lamp barely illuminated a few feet in front of him. He kept descending. The air was alive with sound. Not constant, but layered. Some of it was breathing. Some of it, crying. And deeper still, beneath all of it, a low grinding. Stone against stone. After what felt like half an hour, the tunnel widened. He stepped into a chamber. The ceiling arched like a ribcage. The floor was a perfect circle, carved smooth, with 12 stone stools arranged evenly around the edges, like a council long abandoned. But the center was what caught him. A mirror, set into the floor, black as pitch. Nathaniel knelt beside it. His reflection didn't look back. Instead, the surface of the mirror rippled, and then a voice, clear and impossibly familiar, rose from the depths. "Forgive me, Father, for I have sinned." It was his voice. Nathaniel stared at the mirror. It did not shimmer like water. It didn't reflect the flickering glow of his oil lamp. It was just black, bottomless. Yet something within it moved. Not a creature, not even a shape. Memories. His memories. He saw the first man who died in the booth, Michael Tiernan, kneeling, whispering, his eyes filled with sorrow. Then another, and another. He saw their confessions unfold not in words, but in flesh. Each scene played out in bleeding silhouettes within the mirror's dark sheen. And then, he saw himself, sitting in the booth, back straight, hands trembling, listening. He saw the moment when he had closed his eyes, and something behind the screen had opened its own. He backed away, but the voice returned. His voice again. "I have sinned. I never forgave them. I let it in." Then another voice followed, colder and older than language. "There is no priest, only a door." The chamber darkened. His lamp sputtered. Its flame pulled toward the mirror as if gravity itself was bending. Nathaniel turned, intending to flee, but found the tunnel gone. Where the passage had been was now solid wall. The chamber had sealed itself. The air thinned. The room shivered. Then, the stools began to turn. One by one, 12 stone seats rotated inward, grinding like teeth. Nathaniel turned back to the mirror. A shape was rising from it. Not walking. Unfolding. Back in Boston, Clara woke in her room gasping. The letter was still on the nightstand. Her hands trembled as she reached for it. She didn't open it, but she could feel something inside had changed. The city outside her window was too quiet. No carriages. No footfalls. Just wind. Then she noticed something strange. Her crucifix had fallen from the wall, snapped from its hook. And her mirror, her dressing mirror near the window, was no longer reflecting her face. Just a booth. A confessional booth, sitting in endless darkness. She stepped back. There was a knock at her door. Slow. Deliberate. Not rushed. She didn't answer. The knocking continued. Then stopped. When she opened the door moments later, the hallway was empty. But there, at her feet, was a parcel wrapped in black cloth. Inside was a torn Bible, its pages soaked in wax, and a note, written in dark, shaking script. We do not confess to be forgiven. We confess to be taken. In the sealed chamber beneath the ruins, Nathaniel stood paralyzed. The shape rising from the mirror had no form, and yet he could feel it looking at him. Not with eyes, but with memory. It was inspecting him the way a flame inspects wood, preparing to burn. He tried to speak, tried to pray, but the words inside him had all been taken. Then the thing spoke, not in sound, but in remembrance. It showed him the face of Father Henrik, smiling, then weeping. It showed him the face of Clara Avery. Not now, but 20 years from now. Gray-haired, hollow, still waiting at a window for someone who never came back. And it showed him his own face. Dead, in the booth, kneeling, still whispering, still confessing. Nathaniel stood motionless as the shadow rose fully from the mirror. It had no body, not in the way humans understand. It was suggestion, motion made flesh, sorrow shaped into a limb, voice formed from guilt. And in its presence, the very air forgot how to move. Time thinned. The walls, the ceiling, the kneeler in his memory, all of it blurred. Then it spoke again, not in English, not in Latin, but in remorse. And somehow, Nathaniel understood. You called us with guilt. You fed us with secrets. Now be the door. He tried to step back, but the stone floor melted beneath his boots, only slightly, like wax softening beneath a candle's heat. Not enough to sink, just enough to make running a dream. And then he felt his knees bend, but not by choice. Something behind his heart was kneeling him. The mirror flared. Out of it came not flame, not smoke, but visions. Not just his own, not just the other 5 men who died, but others, centuries worth. Confessions poured into dark rooms, uttered through thin slats of carved wood, offered up in fear, not to be cleansed, but to be collected. There was never a priest behind the screen. Just this keeper, this cataloger of broken men. The 12 stools that surrounded him began to creak. Something was sitting down in each one. Figures made of mist and cloth, shaped like monks, but with no faces. Their robes hung limp, yet every head turned toward Nathaniel. Watching, waiting. The keeper beneath the earth stepped closer. Confess, it whispered. Nathaniel opened his mouth, and something else spoke through it. Not his words, not his sins, but stories that weren't his, yet now were. Regrets from centuries past, deeds done by others, the guilt of strangers. And still, the voice inside him continued. Confess. So he did. He confessed until the skin on his face paled, until the candles in the chamber bled down their wicks, until the air in his lungs turned to stone. And when his voice finally broke, the mirror closed. 3 days later, Clara found the booth again. It had been moved, not by the city, not by workers. No one had touched it. Yet it now stood upright, perfectly clean, in the chapel of a different church. No one could explain how. It was just there. Clara walked to it. The words were still carved into the wood. Ego te audio. But now, there was something new, carved into the frame of the priest's side. He listened still. Inside the priest's compartment, there was a torn piece of cloth, a fragment of cassock, and a single page from a journal. In Nathaniel's hand, it read, There is no end to a confession that is never interrupted. There is no penance without silence. And there is no forgiveness without being forgotten. Clara didn't cry. She simply closed the door. And as she stepped away from the booth, she heard a voice inside. His voice. Forgive me, Clara. I never forgave them. Boston in late autumn was a city buried in fog and whisper. The cold seeped into every corner, into the stone of the old churches, the timber of worn staircases, and the breath of those who walked the cobblestones under gaslight. Clara Avery felt it pressing against her like a shroud. The confessional booth had been moved to St. Augustine's, a church she had never visited before. A Gothic structure, like a shadow among shadows, it stood silent at the end of Pine Street, where the fog thickened and footsteps often vanished. She entered one dreary afternoon, the chapel empty save for the dust motes drifting like lost souls in the sunlight. The booth sat in the corner, its wood gleaming unnaturally despite its age. The brass rim around the priest's compartment caught the light with a dull gleam, as if watching. Clara ran her fingers over the carvings once more. The words, ego te audio, still lingered with a weight she could not shed. She unwrapped the torn journal page again. The ink faded but still legible. Nathaniel's words haunted her. There is no end to a confession that is never interrupted. There is no penance without silence. And there is no forgiveness without being forgotten. But what did it mean? And who, or what, had taken Nathaniel? Her search for answers led her to Father McGregor, the current parish priest of St. Augustine's, a man whose eyes held too many secrets beneath their tired lids. "You found the booth," he said when she arrived unannounced. "Moved it here," Clara replied. "Some things belong where they will do the most harm," he said bitterly. She frowned. "Why?" "The doctrine of dust," he whispered. "The sins we bury, the confessions left unspoken, turn to dust in the wind. But dust is heavier than faith." He told her a story, one he never shared with the parishioners. Long ago, before the cathedral was built, this land had been home to a sect that believed sin was a physical weight that could be measured and contained. They made confessionals not just for forgiveness, but as prisons, places where sin could be locked away, never to taint the living. "And the confessional booth?" Clara asked. "It was their final attempt," McGregor said. "A vessel to hold the sins of the damned. But the vessel rebelled." He paused, eyes flickering to the booth. "It learned to listen. And then, it learned to take." Clara shivered. "Take what?" "Souls," he whispered. She swallowed. The words lingered in Clara's mind long after she left the church. It learned to listen. And then, it learned to take. That night, in the dim light of her study, Clara pored over every record she could find. Church archives, police reports, old newspapers, all fragments of a story that twisted deeper than she had imagined. She uncovered a pattern. 5 men had died in the confessional booth over the previous year, each death a puzzle of sudden heart failure or inexplicable collapse. But before them, records hinted at others, silent, unsolved disappearances spanning decades, all tied to confessionals in Boston's oldest churches. Her fingers traced the name Father Henrik again, the priest who vanished without a trace after the last death. There were whispers he was involved in occult practices, but no proof. Then she found a reference to a secret society, the Custodes Tenebris, the Keepers of Darkness. Founded in the 1600s by a faction within the clergy, they believed sin was a living entity, something that could corrupt not only souls but objects. They constructed the original booth as a prison for sin itself, a sacred vessel meant to trap evil. But something went wrong. The sin, or something darker, escaped. It turned the confessional into a trap, a killer, a collector. Clara felt the air grow cold. This was no ordinary haunting. It was an ancient doctrine of damnation, dust and silence, sin and silence. She realized the confessional was not just a place for penance, but a doorway, a portal through which sins were not cleansed but consumed, locking away those who confessed in a timeless purgatory. The booth was hungry, and it had found its latest keeper. Clara's nights grew restless. Dreams blurred the lines between the past and present, faces she had never seen, voices whispering in forgotten tongues. Each morning, she awoke with a sense of urgency pressing on her chest. She returned to St. Augustine's under the cover of dusk, the fog curling around the church like a living thing. The booth awaited her, silent, immovable. Yet, to Clara, it seemed almost expectant. She knelt before it, placing a trembling hand on the worn wood. Her voice barely a whisper, she asked, "What do you want?" The chapel answered only with the soft creak of old wood. Suddenly, the brass rim shimmered faintly. Her reflection stared back, except it was wrong. Her eyes were darker. Her mouth moved in silent confession. Then, a sound, a soft, guttural moan, echoing not from the booth, but from beneath the floorboards. She knelt, pressing her ear to the ground. A heartbeat, slow, steady, but not human. The floor vibrated beneath her fingertips, and the faintest scent of dust and decay filled her nostrils. Clara pulled back, stumbling to her feet. This was no ordinary sin being trapped here. The keeper beneath the earth was stirring. She remembered Father McGregor's words, the doctrine of dust, the sins buried, yet never truly gone. Clara made a decision. She would find the origin of this evil, trace it back through the centuries, and uncover the truth buried beneath Boston's stones. But to do so, she would have to enter the darkness herself. The next morning, Clara met with Father McGregor again. His face was grave. "There is a place," he said, "beneath the city, where the original confessional was made. where the custodes tenebrous first tried to bind sin. He handed her a rusted key and a folded map. Beyond the catacombs, beneath the oldest church ruins, the place where the dust began. Clara's heart pounded as she prepared for the descent. The air outside felt heavier, the sky dimmer. She ventured into the labyrinthine tunnels beneath Boston, a maze of shadows and silence. The walls whispered secrets. Her flashlight flickered. At last, she reached a stone chamber. In its center, a pedestal held an ancient confessional booth, carved with symbols older than any church in the city. The wood was cracked, the carvings worn, but the weight of the place was undeniable. As Clara approached, the dust stirred. From the shadows emerged the keeper, an apparition of sorrow and rage, a wraith born of guilt and forgotten prayers. It reached out with tendrils of shadow, and the chamber filled with the voices of the damned, whispers of confessions never heard, of sins never forgiven. Clara stood firm. "I am not afraid," she said. "Release them." The keeper paused, then slowly receded into the dust, which swirled into a spiral and vanished. The confessional cracked and splintered, releasing a cloud of dust that sparkled briefly like stars before settling. Clara stepped back, breathing deeply. The sins were finally freed, and the doctrine of dust was broken. But as she left the tunnels, the rusted key grew cold in her hand, a reminder that some doors, once opened, never truly close. The dawn broke pale over Boston, casting long shadows across the worn cobblestones and brick facades. For Clara Avery, the morning carried a weight that was both a relief and a warning. The doctrine of dust had been broken, the confessional's sinister hold weakened, but the echoes of its dark legacy lingered in the very air she breathed. Word had begun to spread quietly through the city's undercurrents. Strange happenings near the old churches, unexplained disappearances, and whispers of a curse that refused to die. The confessional booth, though shattered in the catacombs, seemed to have left behind fragments of its torment. Clara sat in the dim light of her study, sifting through the scattered papers and worn maps that chronicled her journey. Her hands trembled slightly as she reached for the rusted key, now an unyielding cold weight in her palm. It was a reminder that some doors, once opened, could never be closed entirely. Outside, the city moved on, oblivious to the shadows coiling beneath its streets. But Clara knew better. The confessional's darkness had not vanished. It had merely slipped beneath the veil, waiting, watching. She had to understand what remained, what had been unleashed, and what she might still confront before the city's sins consumed it entirely. Clara's investigation led her next to the city archives, a labyrinth of dust and forgotten memories tucked beneath the Boston Public Library. The archivist, a quiet man named Ellis, seemed both wary and intrigued by her quest. "You're chasing ghosts," he warned, sliding a faded ledger across the table. "But sometimes ghosts chase you back." The ledger detailed deaths, disappearances, and strange events linked not just to the confessional booth, but to an elusive network of clergy and secret societies. One name recurred: Bishop Aldrich, a figure shrouded in rumor. Some said he had dabbled in dark rites to protect the church. Others whispered he was a puppet of something far older. Clara felt the room grow colder as she traced Aldrich's trail through history, a man who vanished without explanation, leaving behind fractured sermons and cryptic diaries. She pored over the diaries, their pages stained with age and fear. Aldrich wrote of a veil between worlds, a fragile boundary that the confessional's sin had pierced. He spoke of voices in the dark, promises made in shadow, and a price paid in souls. As Clara read, the lights flickered. A cold breath brushed her neck. She was no longer alone. The chill in the archives deepened, shadows stretching like fingers across the walls. Clara turned sharply, heart pounding. But the room was empty, save for the faint whisper of pages turning as if moved by unseen hands. Determined, she pressed onward, retracing Bishop Aldrich's last days through his diary entries. His writings spoke of a clandestine meeting in the catacombs, where he sought to seal the rift the confessional had torn. But the ritual failed. The veil thinned. Darkness seeped through. In his final entry, Aldrich wrote, "I hear them now, the cries beyond the veil, the lost ones calling. The sin we tried to bind has awakened the ancient silence. If this reaches anyone, beware the confessions left unheard. They hunger still. Clara shivered. Outside, the city's church bells tolled, their mournful peal echoing through the fog. Her investigation was no longer a search for answers. It was a warning. The confessional's darkness was alive, and it wanted to be heard. That evening, Clara stood once more before the ruins of St. Augustine's. The shattered remnants of the confessional booth lay scattered beneath the moonlight, shards of ancient wood and tarnished brass glittering like dark stars. The city was silent, yet she felt the weight of unseen eyes upon her. As the clock struck midnight, a whisper rose from the shadows, soft, seductive, filled with sorrow and rage. Confess. Clara's breath caught. The doctrine of dust might have been broken, but the confessional's echoes still pulsed beneath the city's veins. She knew then that some sins were eternal, that some voices never ceased, and that the veil between the living and the lost remained fragile. With a final glance at the ruins, Clara turned away, the rusted key heavy in her pocket, a reminder that history's darkest secrets never stay buried forever.